So welcome everybody to our latest PCDN Weekly Career Impact Chat. Today we have Dr. Niousha Roshani, who is an incredible professional who has about 2 decades long experience or more working in peace building, social change, the nonprofit sector, technology for social change, education. I mean, so many different areas. If I read her bio, we'd be here for the complete session. So I'll just give a couple of highlights. She really is a visionary who's been working at the front lines of social change for, again, as I said, 2 decades. She is the founder of the Nkanti Foundation and headed that for 10 years, which did a lot of work on civil society, peace building, and youth engagement in Colombia and other countries. She has a PhD in education from University Central London. She's originally from Iran, Ivory Coast, Azerbaijan. So she has a really eclectic background. She's worked a lot with Google and leading technology companies, and also started a really interesting new initiative called Global Black Youth, which she can tell you about, which is trying to raise the engagement and participation of Black youth and in the technology sector and social change sector. And she's agreed to share some of her brilliant experience and wisdom with our group this morning, and really talking about kind of how to advance a career at the intersection of tech and social impact and social change, with a strong perspective for people from the Global South. And just a few technical things again, Dr. Roshani will speak for about 5 to 15 minutes and kind of give some insights and overview of her career. And then we're going to open up, as we do each session, for open discussion. So we'd love to hear your comments, your own stories, your challenges, both for Dr. Roshani, but also to have this go back and forth. This will be recorded, so it'll be on YouTube within about a week. And just to put in a plug, we do this every week. At Thursday at noon Eastern time. Next week, our speaker is Michael Shipler, who's the Vice President for Search for Common Ground, one of the leading peace building organizations in the world. And then the PCDN team will also do sessions. And we also have a session coming up at the end of May with the founder of Pro Fellow, Zakiya Johnson, and kind of how to use fellowships for a career of impact. So Dr. Roshani, I'm going to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you for everybody for joining us today. Please call me Niousha. I'm not really about formalities, so please, and thank you. So good morning, good afternoon to all. We actually just finished one of our webinar series for Global Black Youth that Craig mentioned. I'll be happy to discuss further. And it was really interesting. We had about an average 100 people discussing, especially initiatives from the Global South. But just to go into the topic of our question, of our theme today, it's really funny that I am now talking about tech, because I always said I got into tech by accident. I resisted tech a lot initially, especially because my first degree was actually in engineering. Which I never understood how I got into engineering, but that's another topic. So, but I soon realized how important it was as a tool to communicate, connect, and break boundaries, both physically and structural barriers as well. So just to give, I think the personal story comes a lot into play. I think it's really important to bring in your personal background into what you do and your passion for what you do. So I always actually wanted to become a journalist or reporter and really cover, the stories of people who are often dismissed or disregarded in their communities. So I always envy those who could write easily. I was always a numbers person. I also, even in high school, went down that scientific, career path. So I never, always envy those who had that ability to write easily and creatively. But when I told a friend of mine who is a fantastic writer once, and I said, you're so lucky to be such a good writer, she just looked at me and she said, well, you're a storyteller, right? So you're a natural storyteller. You've been doing that for many years. And funny enough, my name in Farsi means good listener. And as Craig said, just to give a bit of background, I'm not from any particular place, but I would say I'm much more from the Ivory Coast, West Africa, than any other place. I was born in Tehran. My father is actually from Azerbaijan. My mom is from Iran, but they left when I was less than a year old. So I've never been to either of these places, and I spend most of my time between the African continent and Latin America, predominantly between Brazil and Colombia. So I'm a big Colombian. They told me I was more Colombian than Narepa Paisa, but I'd rather be in arroz con coco, right? So Anyway, so Colombia has a very big place in my heart. So does Brazil and Latin America in general. But I like to be able to connect the knowledge producers from both the African continent and Latin America in a South-South collaboration. So I started basically to record stories of population, like I said, that who are often disregarded, whose views are often dismissed, and who can be very valuable knowledge producers, both in their challenges and their realities, but also in the solutions that they offer. So as I was doing my PhD and I was focusing on the Colombian conflict and young people in the Colombian conflict, one of the youths, told me, you as an academic are reinforcing the negative stigma of young people, right? Especially young people of African descent, and you're furthering that stigmatization. So I felt very guilty, and I realized that as I was going and working with other humanitarian organizations, I realized that we often use that language of disadvantaged and underserved, marginalized, and these are terms that I often cringe at when I hear it right now. So I started to shift that look and looking at how is it that young people and communities who are often in more remote areas are using different forms of media, right, to communicate, to tell the stories, to share the stories, but also to communicate with each other, to connect and really reinforce that social fabric among themselves, right? So I started to see that more and more in Colombia. As I was, moved to Brazil and worked in Brazil, I realized that there are a lot of similarities between the Brazilian and Colombian context, but very little bridges, very few bridges where existed between the two countries. There are often comparisons, not just in academia, but also in other projects between like Mexico and Colombia, Guatemala and Colombia, but very little between the two countries. And especially considering that the two countries have the two largest number of Black populations in Latin America. So I started to basically look at, and how is it that we might build those bridges? And I started to, especially in citizen journalism, looking at what is it that they're doing positively. And my whole outlook changed. I could never go back to what I did, for example, for my PhD thesis. But even for my PhD thesis, I looked at how young people negotiate hustle, right? Like they say in Colombia, rebusque, using, for example, media and digital tools to overcome those barriers and to reinvent their realities. And it was fascinating to see that. So as I was doing this, I started to engage more with other institutions, especially with MIT and the different tools that they use. And I was invited by the Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society at Harvard University to go on board and really look at what are the counter narratives that young people use, the digital tools that they use to basically counter hate speech online, racist speech online, like digital racism. And that was fascinating, looking at different ways that they do that. And as I was doing this, I started to look at other countries in Latin America. Then I started to realize that what young people are doing, for example, in the African continent was extremely important. And they're utilizing and maximizing digital tools to overcome all of those structural barriers that we often hear about, but also to rewrite the narratives. And the narratives are really at the core of any of the SDGs or the development goals. And obviously they're using digital tools for that. So as I was doing this, and I realized that we need to really connect, highlight the work that they're doing, but also connect young people in these spaces to each other and really create that global community of young Black disruptors and innovators that are doing fantastic work that is often, I would say more than often, completely disregarded, dismissed, and like a missed opportunity from those our global dialogue, whether it's on hate speech online or on AI, emerging technology, and any forms of ethics, and even now the global pandemic. We often focus on what's happening, for example, the global north, whether it's vaccines or initiative responses, but we're not looking at what is it that they're doing that we can learn from, right? So anyways, I don't want to speak for way too much longer. I'm much rather have this be an interactive project, but I just want to give a quick overview of the new organizations that I'm not sure if it's an organization, but it's actually a movement, and it's coming together. It's like basically creating a global community of young people of African descent and to really highlight, the disruptive and innovative and entrepreneur work in mitigating, for example, the economic impact of coming with new solutions in technology and innovation, entrepreneurship, and in different spheres. And the reason, and especially coming from the global south, but also connecting them with the rest of the diaspora. What is it that, for example, Afro-Europeans are doing that is extremely valuable, and how do we might connect them to Africans or even young people in the Pacific, or Afro-Iranians, which I found out recently that was a population that was completely disregarded, or even Afro-Turk, Afro-Chinese, and really create that global community of young people of African descent in technology, innovation, entrepreneurship. So, so I came to basically value much more technology. I'm still not a coder, but I do work with a lot of hackers and coders and people at the intersection of these different fields. So with that said, like I said, I can go more in details, but I also invite you, we had, just to summarize a bit more, we had a series of webinars. Last week, we had one on basically, Black communities' response to COVID-19 and their innovative solutions. We had the first one on digital rights and misinformation, and we had speakers from Brazil, South Sudan, South Africa, and Nigeria. And it was the first time to really, have somebody, for example, from South Sudan discuss and exchange their views, perspective, realities, but also responses with somebody in Brazil, and that was really key. Today, we had the same kind of interaction with somebody from Colombia and other experts on the continent and somebody from the US. And there was a question that came from the crowd from Europe that was extremely valuable. And it was the first time that you really saw, like, for example, like we're facing exactly the same challenges in South Africa as we are, for example, in Colombia. But then, like, how is it that we might learn from each other? For example, this the speaker that we had was is a doctor from the Choco, and what is it that they're doing despite all of the limitations they have? And then what is it that we can learn from in Mozambique, for example, and we can do the same, and how we might, establish that collaboration. So anyways, and then the next one we're having next week is on entrepreneurship and looking at what is it that young people are doing as entrepreneur initiatives to mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic. So anyways, I'll leave it open to you, and please ask me more questions. I might have left some details out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niousha. So that was a wonderful overview, and I would encourage everyone, I put in the link for Global Black Youth in the chat box, so you can sign up for their webinars or just follow how to engage with them. And they really are doing amazing work to kind of connect the global South, because too much of development and social change work is north to south versus south to south. So Shadi had a bunch of questions. So what I would say is we're going to start going through questions, and we'd like it also to be a discussion. So if you would like to if you want us to turn on your mic, or you'd like to say something, go to the participant box, so click on participants. There's a place to raise your hand there, and we'll get to your questions in order, or you can put your questions in the chat box. So Niousha, I don't know if you can read those, but I'll just summarize a couple. So Shadi put up a bunch of questions. So how to enter the tech domain if someone doesn't necessarily have that tech background? What are some courses you'd recommend or some training points? So let's just start with those two, and then we'll get to other questions. But basically, if someone is not trained in tech and they want to start working at this intersection, what is your wisdom or knowledge for how to make that transition?
Yes, thank you. I see that Shadi had a lot of questions. So I would say, like I said, I have an engineering background, but I never really used it as much as I would have wished, maybe. But so you don't necessarily need to be a tech specialist. I know a lot of people who work in the tech field, because there's so many aspects of tech, especially when it comes to ethic and really thinking analytically about the issues that tech might bring, but also the opportunities that you need social scientists in the field. So there's there's a lot of lawyers, for example, that look at the legal aspect, but you don't need to be I have more of an anthropological background, and I was able to be part of the team and really bringing that social science perspective into it. Like, I think that Craig highlighted that there is great fellowship, not just at the Berkman Klein Center, but also there's coming up, like there's different, even at Harvard, there's one coming up, I think the deadline is next week, for the Shorenstein at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Mozilla Tech Fellowship. There's a whole list of tech opportunities and tech fellowship, if obviously you have to have some kind of background and working at the intersection of it. But how we might go into it, if you look at more and more, not just in any like NGOs and organizations, but young people are doing this in a very organic way. If you work with young people, you will eventually get into tech, into digital ways, So looking at, for example, how journalists are fighting misinformation, not just journalists, but also CSOs. There's a lot of free courses that are offered by the Harvard, for example, extension schools that you can go to and you can get them for free. Same thing with MIT. Stanford is also offering a lot of free courses. Google is offering a lot of free trainings. But like I would say, you don't need a technical background. One of the questions that Shadi asked is, if you need a PhD, definitely not. I did a PhD, and unless you want to go to, down the academic route and be a professor, I do not recommend a PhD in this field. I don't, especially nowadays, more and more people are realizing they don't really need that what route to enter the field. So I would highly disencourage that. So what is your advice for networking effectively in this area of work? Like I said, it's really important that you start engaging with these. I think, for example, if you look at the way I've dealt, I worked with Save the Children a long time ago, right? But if you look at, for example, the work of Save the Children now, they're focusing more and more on digital rights, right? Digital rights and childhood and youth. So all the organizations are going down that route. So it's really, even if you work for any kind of these organizations, you're able of tech and human rights. I'm not sure if I can give you, you can write to me and I can give you some specific organizations and tools that you can, that will help you. I'm trying to read the question at the same time as we're speaking, just to move on from Shadi. And Shadi, please write to me. I'll be happy to assist you more in this. Let's see. Yes, Radgan. Yes, I also was really excited that we had somebody from South Sudan last week as an international speaker. He has an initiative called Defy Hate Speech Now, and he is fantastic. And like I said, we'll soon upload all of our webinars and you're able to hear him. But he does really fantastic work, and I never thought that we'd find somebody so, such an expert in his field, especially coming from South Sudan and talking about digital rights. I'm trying to find out if there is going down the questions. Bonjour from France. Hello, Erica. Okay, so just trying to find there's a question, sorry.
So I'll jump in here. So again, we'd love, if you have a question, click on participants and you can raise your hand because we'd love to have people share your stories, your challenges. And just to make a plug for finding fellowships, PCDN's a great resource. You'll find tons of things. And then Zakiya Johnson, who we'll have on in 3 weeks, Pro Fellow is one of the best databases of fellowships in the world. And there are tons of fellowships out there, but there's a whole strategy how to get fellowships. You can't just apply overnight. And so Niousha, I would ask a question going similar to what we had earlier. So for people who are not tech savvy, what do you see as the growth areas? Should they become data scientists, understand data visualization, learn about drones? What are the growth areas that you see where people could build careers at this intersection of tech and social change?
Thank you. Right. I still don't know, like I said, how to code or anything like that. So I don't know. I know how to fly a drone, but that's about it. So no, you don't necessarily need to have a tech career to get into the tech field. I think, like I said, there's a great intersection of social sciences and tech. So I would say read a lot about what's happening, especially in the digital rights spheres, right? The digital rights sphere, you have, for example, hackers, but you also have journalists, you have social scientists, you have activists working at that field, because it's about information. You don't necessarily need to be a techie to care about, for example, misinformation, how misinformation, for example, can lead to hate speech and can be at the source of, genocide and harmful speech that, like right now, for example, access to information about health, how is it that people in rural areas can access, different forms of media, and not just tech, can also be television, right? Or radio, and for them to access the right information to protect their health. So there's, you don't need to go down that career, but it's important to read about what's happening out there. That's really key in this. For example, if you look at what's been happening in Iran from the uprisings that they had since December to, they were hit right by the pandemic right after that. So how is it that they're being able to use, for example, tech tools in different ways? It can be in Twitter, it can be social media, and to really, get the stories out there and communicate with the rest of the world. So I think these are topics that if you're a human rights activist, you get interested in, and that's already a way to be involved in tech and human rights. I'm not sure if I'm being specific enough, but I think it's just interest and reading more about it. You don't need to have a career or sign up for a Google course if you don't want to. If you want to, that's fine, but you don't need to be a specialist in data to understand this.
Okay, so there's a question from Bio, which if you want to take a look at, he's based in Sweden. and asking about representing different African diaspora in Europe, and how to talk about, if you want to read that one.
Yes, give me 1 second.
And please keep the
Yes.
questions coming. And we'd love to also turn on videos and hear like your direct voice, you know, if you have that problem. So just click on participants and raise your hand.
Thank you very much, Bio. So actually, your question is fantastic. So for the webinars that we're holding right now, I would say 3 of our partners are Afro-European organizations that are supporting this initiative. So I think that it's really important, and we're trying to also set up in the UK in Parliament a division on that focused on you know, people of color and digital rights. So there's a lot of small initiatives happening, but they're all very separate. So what we're trying to do as Global Black Youth is really convening all these initiatives and really connecting. So I think that if you connect to your communities, you'll be able to, you know, connect to a much wider community of the African diaspora in Europe, and we're able to connect you to other different opportunities as well. Like I said, Craig, PCDN is also a great source of information and network. All of the people who have passed through the County Foundation I led for 10 years have utilized and maximized the opportunities that are presented by the network. But I'll be happy to you know, for you to connect with the community, and then happy to connect you with other people in the African diaspora in Europe.
Okay, I think Catalina has a question, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hey, here from the land of Arepa, saying hi to you, Niousha. So excited to have here with you. And I have a couple questions. I don't know whether you will be able to answer them, but I just want your expert opinion and your take on it. One is with regards to technology and the global pandemic that overnight forced many to sort of have their education online, be able to have computers, and those of us like us that we have like connectivity, we're struggling, but we're pushing through. In the tech world, like what are the discussions about sort of this big inequality between those that are still not very well connected in the global south? There is no basic infrastructure for connectivity. How is tech addressing that sort of problem between the ones that have Wi-Fi and the ones that this El Salvadoran college student, I don't know if you saw it, he had to climb a tree to be able to grab some signal to be able to do his classes in El Salvador until people discovered what the hell he was doing up in that tree and just helped him go to a school because he had nothing at home. And then I'll ask you another question.
Thank you very much, Kata. So it's really interesting because this is exactly what we talked about this morning and also last week during the webinars. So for example, something that's really interesting that, and this is what we're trying to also work on digital rights and the digital divide. And I think a lot of people take that for granted, right? So we talk about, for example, there's a speaker from Kenya discussing, you know, the issue in Kenya, for example, most of the young people do not have access to a computer, less, you know, Wi-Fi. So the extent that it will have is maybe a smartphone. But what, for example, South Africa is doing is they passed digital rights as a human rights. Right, so this is something that's recently they're trying to push that at the African Union so that the 54 countries in the continent also adopt the same strategy and make this a human rights. Then we can push government to really provide internet connection. So what South Africa is going to do, and very soon, not yet implemented, but in parks and communal areas, they're going to offer free Wi-Fi. So to make sure that everybody has access to the internet and be able to connect, and also like stationary computer, you know, like computer stations and everything. So it's a very, and discussing one of the issues that also were brought up in Brazil and throughout the African continent, excuse me, was the cost of data, right? And how is it that we might push, for example, the big tech companies to take that into consideration, the communication companies, and how is it that they might, especially during the pandemic, either lower or offer a very, you know, certain percentage, or like makes, for example, all the information on the pandemic in South Africa is now free. So people are able to access information about the pandemic and the measures and everything and the opportunities for free, right? So the certain gigabytes that's going to be free, but also offer a certain package that's affordable or complete for free for people. So we might, when we do this, we cannot just take the government accountable. We have also to take, for example, the the big tech companies accountable and the big communication companies accountable. So one of the things I'm trying to do right now is I've started to engage and work with the new Ministry of Science and Tech in Colombia. It's still very much at its preliminary stage. And I'm trying to advise them basically. One is to establish their global engagement and partnership. So how we might, strengthen the collaboration between certain countries on the continent, certain countries in Latin America, but in this case, Colombia. And in the conversation, I realized this morning, I was a bit sad because as I was listening, for example, from our perspective from this doctor in the Choco, where she was saying the same thing as you, like she was saying, we don't even have a lab, we don't have technology. So it's really hard for us to discuss all of these initiatives that sound really good, but they're not possible. And for example, the advancement of the responses in South Africa were fantastic, but then they have access to so many, for example, think tanks and research institutes and initiatives that are so much more at the front line of all these responses. So I realized that communities, especially communities in poor regions in Latin America, but especially Black communities, are completely deprived of all these, advancements. And that made me, but then that establishes and furthers the need to be able to, to establish, for example, those bonds and those bridges between, a South-South collaboration, not always looking at, copying what's happening with the US because the contexts are completely different, right? So I think one thing I'm trying to push, but it's still very much at its early stages, is digital rights. We need to have a digital rights strategy for Colombia, for instance, right? It doesn't really exist. And I'm thinking, if the Ministry of Tech and Science does not push for this, who is going to push for it, right? And I was trying to, for example, for last week's webinar, I was trying to identify somebody who would be, very an expert in this field, an activist in this field. It was really hard because you have, for example, individuals doing some kind of research work, but you don't really have a digital rights, group that's really furthering that work in Colombia. So I hope I answered to the extent. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. And I love to hear sort of everything, more about digital rights or the process in Colombia. Now I want to ask you a career question. So there's a bunch of us here in the PCDN community that are outside of technology, and you seem to be able to speak tech fluently and interact freely in the world. So since you can navigate in both worlds, what are good skills, or what are the tech people looking that people that are in the social good space could offer so that they can enter the tech world? It's kind of similar to the first question, but in terms of from their perspective, what do they seem is useful that people that are trained in various disciplines, and we group them, for lack of a better term, social good, could be offering, or at least could be looking at, oh, this is a skill I better sort of pay attention to, but this is something good I could offer?
No, that's a very good point, Kathy. Thank you. So more and more these big tech firms or tech boards, are looking for a social scientist to really bring in that, they started this initiative, many years ago, looking at tech for social good, tech for good. You have this from the World Economic Forum, to Facebook. I don't know if you they just launched 2 days ago, the 20 people who are going to be like the Supreme Court people who are going to basically to object the founder in any initiative, the actions that Facebook is taking. And if you look at, for example, the people on the board, you have professors in law, you have activists who have no formal training in tech, but who have been engaged in that sphere. So I think that one thing that's necessary is that they always look, for example, Stanford, well, they closed the fellowship in December, but they're having it every year. They're always looking for projects that have a social impact and social aspect, but as obviously linked and intersect with tech. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. I would say to everybody over here, don't be scared to apply for them, right? But your project has to have obviously an intersection, a tech perspective without having the tech technicality, knowledge, right? So they're looking for that, and they're really eager to have that perspective, and they need that because obviously, as we become more and more digital, we don't realize the extent, for example, surveillance capitalism has already increased and is increasing even more, right? So governments are taking opportunities of that need to be, digitally connected to really use the data and use, the citizens' data to really like to surveil them and increase that surveillance, right? So we have to be very wary of all this. And I think that always matters to us. Like I said, I was at first I was like, oh God, I don't want to hear about this anymore. I don't want to hear about blockchain anymore. And you see that and you think that it's such a foreign world, but it's actually very much interconnected with what we do now. And I remember one of the tasks that we had, I did a project with Google when we brought in a cohort of young Black Brazilians to Colombia with other, Black Colombians. And in one of the open discussions we had in Cali, somebody said, oh, but what about this that's happening? What about that? Offline basically, right? So what do you say about this? And then the girl from Brazil just responded, she said, lo digital es lo real, no? The digital is real. It's not just what happens online is often a reflection of what happens offline. So what, right now our worlds are interconnected. We cannot just resist in what's happening. So I would say, don't be shy. Look for these scholarship, bring in, for example, especially when it's a research project, they're always looking, for example, at your new perspective and adding that, right? And I think coming from Colombian perspective it's so new. And unfortunately, and both in Colombia and Brazil, those who are in this field are more the privileged ones, right? So for example, you have an initiative at Los Andes and you have an initiative at La Javeriana, all very much white-led and the same people from the same background, Los Andes, blah, blah, right? But it's very hard to find people from the communities bringing the knowledge. And it's not that complicated. And tech does not need to be such a monster, right? It's not, it's actually very accessible. So I would say, like, especially when you look at social media, we're all in tech. We all use social media nonstop on our phones. We're constantly connected. So we're actually all very much involved in the social media and in tech, and but we don't realize it. So I don't know if that answers.
Thank you. There's another question from Bio asking if you want to take a read about basically how do you protect the ethics of engaging people and not being exploited?
Yeah, I think that, thank you, Bayo, for this great question. I think this gets really much into the technical, but I wish that you were in the webinar last week, but we'll upload it and we'll have other engagement as well. So privacy is something that's very much a huge topic that's discussed especially in the global north, I would say much more than the global south. I mean, obviously intellectual property and privacy is very important, especially in the countries where you have a lot of intervention, not just from the national governments, but from, the Chinese government and the Russian government, especially on Eastern Africa. So this is why we need to engage much more the perspective and the know-how of people from the global south in these conversations, right? So for example, in the 20 members of that so-called Supreme Court of Facebook, we have, it's not a lot, but we have 3 Africans, which two of them are African women. And one of them is extremely young from Cameroon. She's fantastic. So they're going to be really be able to bring in the perspective that's often completely disregarded, right? And especially when it comes to AI ethics and everything, you see it is completely led by the global north. But I think that a lot of the conversations I've had with people, say in Brazil, in Colombia, even in Cuba, right? That's actually getting more and more digital, which I find fascinating, is that people are so concerned right now with the digital divide and access to the internet, that they're not at the stage right now to think about privacy. Privacy is important, but for them it's like, wait, first we need to have access. We have a huge digital divide. We don't have a digital strategy. Most people are completely digitally illiterate in our countries. How is that we might be able to, bridge that gap? But I think it's very important that while we do this, we take into account issues around privacy, because that's how their data is used and how, intellectual property is infringed upon. So this is why we need to push governments and also the civil society in these countries. And in Colombia, I've been trying to push, but they don't really seem to. They're like, well, we don't really need digital strategy, at the Ministry of Tech and Science. And I was been pushing. I said, it's vital. We need to have that to be able to also include that. While we push to bridge the digital divide, we also need to think about privacy in these contexts.
Okay, I'm going to make one quick logistical comment. I'm going to put up a poll in Zoom just so we get your feedback about how we can improve. So it should show up on your screen. So if you can fill that out, and please, we still have about 10 more minutes. If there's any questions or comments, I'll make one, or actually 2. So one is, you know, a lot of people say that tech is going to create all these new jobs and we're going to have all these new industries, which some of them are developing. Like a lot of the jobs of today, no one could have envisioned 10 years ago, you know, coder, social media, drone operator. But other people really project a dystopian future where there's going to be a small group of elite people who have good jobs and controlling the technology, and then just masses of people around the world who are stuck in the informal and gigafied economy without any benefits or security. You know, and the ILO says we need to create 600 million new jobs just to keep youth unemployment where it is. And how do you fall on that big picture thing? Are you an optimist that you think the world's going to get better, or it's just going to become a harsh, miserable world, and unless we create new policies like universal basic income, like we're just basically in trouble?
Thank you, Craig. You brought up a very complex question, and I don't think there's only one answer. There's a lot of debates going around, and this is obviously something that I've been thinking about, especially, like I said, because although I do appreciate the tools that technology can bring, and I see it in young people and I'm excited about it, I'm also, you know, I've been resisting tech for a very long time, and I'm happy when I'm disconnected, right? So I do fear that, yes, and this is a debate that we've been having for a lot of the boards that I've been sitting on, you know, to take into account that, yes, we might be very enthusiastic about, you know, this new app and this new project that's coming around and this and this and this, but we have to realize that there is, for example, there's been inequality, and that's what I'm trying to push also, especially the inequality between the global south and the global north, but that inequality will rise with this tech intervention, especially at the pace that we're going, unless we're able to take into account, you know, not just the perspective of the global south, but also the knowledge that's been produced by the global south. So we're able to tailor the direction of that tech is taking at the moment. You know, one of the greatest arguments I've been trying to have, especially is around AI and how not to think about, you know, how we might, a lot of conversation around how we might adapt AI to the global south, especially to the African context. And my you know, argument is like, we don't need to necessarily adapt, we need to create, and a lot of this AI is being created from global south that fits in the context, and it is tailored to the context. But also within the country, we also have to understand that while we're very enthusiastic about, oh, this is happening in innovation in Ghana, in South Africa, in Mozambique, that is only a very small percentage of those people who have access to that know-how and that digital sphere, right? So it's often still the privilege. And we have to like push forward to include all those people, like especially in rural regions. How is it that we might include the women in this context, and then for them to be included in that tech sphere and that know-how. So unless we do this, yeah, we're doomed. I'm by nature, I'm an optimist, right? So I'm thinking, and I see how the global south is innovating, and I want to highlight this. And I think that unless we're able to highlight this, not only will we not believe in ourselves and our ability to bridge that gap, but also to innovate from our end, we're also not giving credit to the work that's been done and the knowledge that's being produced. And then so we can support and further and amplify the work that they're doing. So I would like to do the same thing, for example, for youth in Colombia, which I think that they are doing, but you know, at very small scale, but they're not connected to a greater community where their work can be amplified, right? So, and, you know, connect them to the rest of the world. So I think that unless we're able, and then focusing on youth, looking at Africa that has the largest population of young people in the world, unless we're able to tap into them as knowledge producers, you know, we're going to basically go downhill, and I'm not going to be so optimistic about the future. So that's why I think the work that we're trying to do is not just, oh, why is it that you focus, for example, on Black youth? They ask me, is because I'm looking at Africa. It is the largest a number of youth in the world. Latin America comes second after Africa. So unless we're able to focus on them, I think our whole, you know, global economy and our whole world is going to go downhill, and we're going to see the number of unemployment rise.
Okay.
I'm sorry if I'm not answering, and you know, but there's no one answer one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. I reposted the poll because some people said they had some challenges accessing it, and that's a huge question. And also, people might want to listen to the podcast with Flynn Coleman that was, I think, out 1 week ago or 2 weeks ago, and take a look at her book called The Human Algorithm. It's a very interesting, somewhat optimistic perspective on technology. So there's a question from Farhad. Given the already donor fatigue caused by further strain by COVID-19, how do you see the future of development aid?
Aid is something that I've always been against, but that's because I come from the African continent, and I see how aid damaged the continent much more than it has helped it. Especially when you look at the African continent, it's one of the richest regions in the world, but yet is the most exploited and deployed from other opportunities. So I think that we need to look at, God, it's such a complex question, but I think that we need to look at, so my whole theory is that unless we're able to change the narratives, because the reason that, for example, the African continent is the way it is, and the reason, for example, Latin America is in the same situation is because the narrative is at the core of it. So that negative narrative that nothing positive can come from these regions also, feeds in directly into the development goals, the SDGs, but also the foreign policies that affect these countries from, IMF, the World Bank, and other countries. So I think that we need to really disrupt that narrative, and we disrupt that narrative by highlighting and supporting the work that people are doing in the region, the solution that they're creating for their own communities to the region. So if you look at, for example, there's only been, if I believe, 2 countries who have said no to aid and who are doing much better and who have been able to advance, Botswana and Namibia, but that's historically. So the way they've been able to handle aid was completely different, and they're much more ahead of it. So I don't think aid is really the response, but we need to tackle, there's not only one response to it, we need to tackle the whole underlying system and structure and disrupt it that's been in place since decolonization to be able to really address the issue right now. So just to give you, for example, a quick answer, if you look at the Chocó in Colombia, it's the land of resources, right? You have energy coming from the sky, you have water pouring all the time, but then yet they have an issue of energy, which makes no sense. So how is it that we might think about what are the natural resources and know-how, the potential of people, where we're able to, be sustainable and not have to wait and rely on the government to bring in the energy to the Chocó, for instance?
So we have about 5 minutes left. I have one question. So one is, we're based in Medellin, and Medellin has gone from being one of the most violent cities in the world to one of the more innovative in the global south, still filled with problems. And some people would say it's partially due to public infrastructure, good governance, but also a focus on innovation across sectors. So we have a place called Ruta N, which is a huge innovation hub that's public-private, has about 100 employees. And are you aware of other innovation hubs like Ruta N around the world? Basically the question is, have other countries in the global south created these innovation hubs that bring together government, private sector, education to kind of facilitate innovation and technology for the public good across kind of populations?
Yes, absolutely. So one of my dreams would be to see something like Ruta N in the Chocó eventually one day. So, but the whole context of Medellin, talking about narratives, has a lot to do with it. The sense of belonging and the sense of identity in Antioquia is very strong, and I think that helps a lot for them to believe in themselves, but also to invest into their own community. Identity is at the core of the way we do things, the way we do it. That's why I was saying, Kata, that we really need social scientists to bring in that little touch that most people would not be able to think about. So thinking about different, yes, there's a lot of great things happening, especially as I dive more into the work of Global Black Youth. We come across not just young people who are doing fantastic work that I'm just completely awed, and I think, where have I been? I haven't done anything, to also, initiatives like Ruta N. For example, there's something in Cape Town called Zindi that works with young entrepreneurs, but not just young entrepreneurs, scientists, academics, and really bringing public policy, the private sector, and civil society together to address a lot of the issues, but also to support, not just young South Africans, but young Africans in this sphere. There's a lot of other initiatives happening, like in Ghana, for example, in Nigeria, there's great things happening. This is why we really try to, I would like to really further the work and the collaboration between South-South, and not just looking at this bilateral, US-Colombia in this case.
Okay, so I think 2 more questions have come in, one from Uruguay. For people who aren't in tech but are very passionate about social change, can you just talk about why you think tech is so important and your personal passion for it to inspire everybody?
I'm not, like I said at the beginning, I'm not a person who can talk about, I'm not passionate about tech. I haven't coded since I was 12. So like I said, I would resist it. In my computer science class during my engineering degree was the worst class. I used to come crying out of it every day. But so I think that it's, but what I did realize is when I saw how young people were using tech, and like I said, even just starting with social media in its different forms, to recreate their opportunities, their realities, right? Their experiences, and then rebuild their presence and not just look at their past. So for example, say a young person, I came across a young person in Rio who, when he was 11, decided that, you know what, he's from the Complexo do Alemão, which is a comuna, right? Like a favela in Rio. And he decided he wanted to tell the stories of his people from their perspective, right? So he started with a very traditional newspaper, and then his teacher helped him when he was only 11. But that, you know, that went into something much bigger, really including like opportunities, but perspective, the news from the community, with this newspaper. And then, you know, when there was a lot of shootouts between the police and the drug traffickers in Complexo do Alemão, very similar to the comunas, and for example, in Medellin, he started to tweet right from his home, and he was very young. He was, I think, 15 or 16 at the time. He started to tweet out, this is happening, and posting photos. And then, you know, when the shootout stopped, he opened his door one day, and there was like all the media, international media platforms and companies who were there waiting his door because they had been receiving his tweet and being able to inform the international community what was happening. And then from there, they're like, wow, you did fantastic work in citizen journalism. And then from there, he was able to transport, it's called A Voz da Comunidade, La Voz da Comunidad, no? From a paper-based newspaper to an online digital platform. So, and he's doing fantastic work. He's, I think now in his early 20s. We worked with him a lot, and he's doing really fantastic in bringing the, you know, reporting what's happening in his community, bringing about the opportunities, but also the work that they're doing. And like, for example, one of the youth is build his own 3D printer to print masks and protective gears for the community and health workers that governments are completely oblivious of, right? So, I mean, when I see this kind of initiative brought by young people in tech, that's when I become passionate about, right? And I think, wow, this is fantastic. When they were able to use digital tools to sell, for example, their product or access markets that have been completely excluded and they've been denied to all their lives, right? Because of their background, the socioeconomic background, or because their ethnicity. So I think this is what makes me passionate about it. When I see the opportunities, obviously, like I said, it comes with a whole lot of challenges that we need to take into account. But I think there's so much more opportunities, and to disrupt that narrative, that negative narrative, and tell your story to the rest of the world is extremely powerful.
Okay, so I think the last two questions, one is from Ganesh. I'm not sure, Ganesh, I understand 100%, but you say post-COVID, how do you foresee companies investing in grooming HR? So I assume you mean human resources, not human rights. If you want to put any clarification. Then from Sarah, just what advice would you give to young graduates who want to get experience in social impact? I think those are the two questions. Did you hear that, Niousha? If you can maybe respond. I can't hear you, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't hear the specification. I'm trying to read.
So Ganesh said basically, how do we foresee companies investing in grooming HR, which I assume is human resources? Yeah, he said human. And then there's a question from Sarah, like your general advice for people, recent graduates who just maybe don't have that much experience, where to start.
Okay. Okay, so for post-COVID, so, you know, Ganesh, I would highly recommend that you join. I'm going to answer the question in my perspective, but just to really bring the perspective of the Global South and from other people, our next webinar is going to be on entrepreneurship and really mitigating the economic impact of COVID-19. And I think they're going to discuss a lot about, you know, the large companies and multinationals, but and how they're. So for example, one of the things that we're trying to do, again, is not all the answers, right? But we're trying to work with the private sector and really increasing the diversity in not just at the internship level, but at the high level management level, at the higher level management level, yeah? Sorry. I've been speaking Portuguese and Spanish all morning. So, you know, we're trying to do, well, it's going to be a small grain. Like, we need to really push for this much further. In Brazil, for example, they had something in 2020, and I think that was disrupted also by the pandemic that was called 2020. So by the end of 2020, they will have at least 20% of contratación, how do you say, of hiring of people of African descent, right? So Black Brazilians. A lot of them have failed, but certain companies have been able to reach that goal. And so they're really pushing for that diversity. In Colombia, it's still, we tried to push the same thing with the private sector. Is still not there, and I don't think it's going to be there anytime soon, unfortunately. But I think this is a very complex question that I don't really have an answer to, because I don't work in that field. But we do advise the private sector more like in how to increase the diversity and inclusion. And I invite you to be part of the webinars. I'm sorry, I don't have a direct answer to that.
And
then sorry to Sarah's. Yes, you know what? I think that Craig will be a much better source of opportunities and responses to this, because PCDN is a great source of how to get involved and engaged in the social impact field. But I think that I would advise, if you don't have any experience, you need to start with an internship. Internship or volunteering opportunities, a lot out there. If you have, obviously, especially with the high unemployment rate right now. But if you do have a know-how knowledge, you can also apply for like entry-level opportunities. But I'll let Craig take that, because they have so many resources.
Yeah, so I would say we'll address that in future webinars, or drop us an email, or join the helping line. And my last two questions, and then we'll stop because we're almost at an hour. So one is, what is your favorite company or organization in the world when you just think like is doing this right, this intersection of tech for social change, or a couple? And then the last thing, for people who might want to think about working at this intersection, Mercy Corps hires for these kind of jobs, but Omidyar Network, but maybe your top 5 places to start looking for jobs at this intersection.
Thanks, Craig. I cringe when you ask for that. I'm like, oh. But I remember that, so for example, one of my favorite companies is Second Muse. Is actually well, you know them. They're fantastic. So I really commend them on the work that they do. They also have, some opportunities when they collaborate with other companies. So I would really look into companies like Second Muse. The big techs, I'm not really optimistic about them, so I can't really speak for them. But there's a lot of startups that are doing great work, not just in the global north, but for example, like I said, Zindi is doing really excellent work in South Africa. There's CCC Hub in Nigeria that's doing excellent work. There's a lot of like smaller companies that it depends on your sector. So for example, if you have a business background, there's a lot of startups that look at entrepreneurship opportunities that are really interesting as well. Some other one that look more like entrepreneurship and tech. So I'll be happy to think more, but on the top of my head, these are the companies that I would say I'm much more hopeful, but they're the smaller scale, right?
And then the final comment, Kata, go ahead.
No, I just, my 2 cents on Sarah's question within the current context that we are. So something that has happened that has helped us quite a bit here in Medellin is that we have some friends that opened a restaurant, and the restaurant failed. So they had to close. And then they were in charge of the cafeteria in a school. But then COVID happened and all the schools closed. And they decided, they got the permits from the mayors and all the required permits. And they've been gathering donations and packing up lunches and distributing mercados, like bags with food. Every week they have more and more demand. And one of the 2 things that you can do if you want to acquire field experience, providing that you are able to go out, is how do you use this crisis? And I'm obsessed with this topic of helping others, right? I mean, I do microscopic things that help me tremendously, like go to the supermarket and get food for our guards, because we live in high rises and there is these people that work 12-hour shifts. But if you have the time, if you have the ability to reconvert what you're doing, because right now it's a time of crisis and helping, you could eventually, either it is great for you on a personal level, but it could eventually grow or convert what you're doing right now and build that as actually field experience in which you were actually a useful human. So I would do 2 things during these days. One is looking for opportunities, free online courses to get skills I previously didn't have. And second, I will try to see how I can do something creatively to help the people I can. We bought our masks from a group of women NGO just because we wanted to support them. So a lot of people are now finding creative ways to either survive economically. And if you can insert yourself or be part of on one initiative like that, it might actually turn out in some form of field experience. That's just what I'm saying and what I'm feeling actually.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to add really quick, Craig, so thank you, Kata. So yes, I was just remembering I started doing this as a little girl with my father in the Ivory Coast, so it was a natural thing. But for example, in Colombia, we wanted to just implement a project. It just started around a conversation around, working with capoeira and young people. And we just basically just went to the community and started the work, right? So if there is a drive for it, there's a lot of need for not just volunteers, but if you have the drive to do something good, it starts that way. And before you knew it, you learn about other initiatives and you gain the experience that you need.
So just to close, thank you so much for your time and wisdom and your rich sharing of experience. And we hope to see you in Medellin again. And then one just final question, what are you looking for, how people can help with global Black youth? Like obviously resources, but like what else are you looking for? Just if people on this call or in the future when they watch this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Craig. So we would love to have a diversity of backgrounds and and of people at the webinar. So if you can log into the webinars for next week, it would be fantastic because it would enrich the conversation. And just because it's called Global Black Youth, you don't necessarily have to be Black. It's like saying competition for women's rights. You don't need to be a woman to get involved in this. So it touches upon our global concerns and our global issues. So I would ask you to not just log into the webinars, but also join our global community because it is a global community. And we'll have a lot of parallel conversation as well. Like we plan to have, for example, conversations with other groups, for example, Palestinian groups, indigenous populations who have very similar issues of being marginalized from the rest of the community. So and to really highlight and learn about the great work that they're doing. So and we always need support in different ways. Like Sarah was asking how you might get involved. We always need, because it's basically me and my co-founder who have been pushing for this, and Craig knows very well when you're pushing for a startup, basically you're putting in 99% of the work at the beginning. So we ask for all kinds of support. So but yes, so thank you very much to all of you. It was a pleasure to discuss, and I'll be happy to answer more questions and to support you in any way I can.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everybody, or evening, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.